Good afternoon. Thank you everybody for braving the rain to come out and come out early. Unbelievable. So thank you very much. My name is Caroline Farrell and I'm the Executive Director at the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment. I'm really thrilled that you're all here. I want to take care of a few logistical things first in case you need them. The restrooms are out this door and to the left, so feel free to get up and move around as needed. After the panel, we'll have some wine and hors d'oeuvres and drinks, so please stay after and join in the discussion. And finally, if you have registered for MCLE credits, which if you're a lawyer, you know what those are, you can go to the back table over here, or the back sort of counter over here, and fill out whatever you need to get your credits. So that's the logistical stuff. And now it's my pleasure to welcome you and get into more of the substantive discussion today. So I'm going to start out by doing a little bit of framing around environmental justice, CRPE, and introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to let them tell you more about the various tools and processes that they've developed to help advance environmental justice in the state. So first I want to thank our sponsors who have made this day possible. 350.org, Shoot Mahali, Earth Justice, the University of California Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, the California Environmental Justice Alliance, and Holland and Knight. I really appreciate all of your support. One final logistical thing, I guess, is I've always believed that you can't have too much of CRPE, and there's an event on Sunday at Parkway Theater, Growing Resistance. It's a film about fracking and oil and gas sort of impacted communities and the movement around that. So please join us on Sunday as well. 350.org is sponsoring that event. So just to give a little bit of background on environmental justice and on the Center. The Center on Race, Poverty was founded in 1989, and we're an environmental justice organization. Our mission is to achieve environmental justice and healthy and sustainable communities through collective action and the law. And we employ a variety of different strategies to do that. We work with communities on the ground, doing community-based building and organizing. We provide legal representation to low-income communities of color in the San Joaquin Valley and throughout the country. We have a growing capacity to do statewide policy work to change some of the systems and rules around the environment, environmental protection. And we do a lot of coalition building. You'll hear from some of our partners, and many of our partners are here today, to build a larger movement for environmental justice. And so what is environmental justice? There's a growing acknowledgement and recognition that poor people and people of color are disproportionately impacted by environmental harms and also lack access to environmental benefits. So parks, open space, clean air, clean water. And this recognition has been building over many, many years. Initially, in the 1980s, Toxic Waste and Race was released, which identified that low-income communities and communities of color were disproportionately located next to hazardous waste, landfills, and disposal sites. 20 years later, that report was updated, and the statistics only got worse. Recently, the California Department of Public Health released a report that showed that Latino school children were more likely, 46 times or 46% more likely to be located near or attending schools in areas where the most dangerous pesticides are applied. Frac Tracker Alliance released a report that showed that Latino school children were more likely to be going to school within 1 mile of a well that had been fracked than white children in the state. So this is every single time we look at whether or not there's a disproportionate impact, we have found a disproportionate impact. And really the movement of environmental justice over generations has been about how do you solve that impact? How do you address that impact? And in many ways, there's been a disconnect between agencies and communities. And I think part of that is in the definition of what environmental justice is. So environmental justice is often defined by state and federal agencies as fair treatment and meaningful involvement. People are at the table, they get the same treatment no matter where they live. And the community defines environmental justice based on the right to have a clean and healthy environment where we live, work, play, and pray, regardless of race, regardless of place, regardless of income. And I think this slide can sometimes help us explain in a visual way, and I might be in people's way, to see. But this idea of if everybody gets the same thing, you don't always end up in the same place because you don't start in the same place. So if you just want sort of fairness and equality, everybody gets the same box, but it doesn't really matter if they end up seeing the game or not. With environmental justice, it's about seeing the game, and what do you need to do to get there? And in our case, seeing the game is a clean, healthy environment. And so our panelists today, who I'm really excited to introduce, are people who I have known for a number of years. Met, I think, all of them from fairly close to when they began their careers, and was a little bit but I'm very happy to. And what's great is that they are advancing the movement. They've been building on the success of decades and decades of work of communities who've been most impacted, who have formulated solutions to the problems that they have been experiencing. And now, given the demographic shifts in the state, given the increased responsiveness of decision makers of color who want to hear from communities who are most impacted, we're beginning to get traction. And so these panelists have developed a variety of different tools, processes, opportunities for impacted communities to have a real voice and really begin to change, not just what the process is, but also what the outcomes are. So thank you very much. I'm very excited to introduce them all. So Arsenio Mataka, the Assistant Secretary of Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs at Cali, PA, will start off talking a little bit about some state tools. Amy Vanderwalker from California Environmental Justice Alliance is going to talk a little bit about some of the policy work that's been happening. Roger Lynn from Communities for a Better Environment is going to talk a little bit about some of the traditional legal tools around land use and civil rights. And Ingrid Brostrom from the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment is going to talk a little bit more about some of the evolving work that we've been doing. So.
Great. I'm glad Caroline has this image up because it's actually an image that I use in my presentations at the state now. And so it's a very interesting dialogue when you work with the state agency and you put up this slide. Because Caroline is exactly right. You know, the way environmental justice is codified in state law, it just calls for fair treatment. And I usually start by explaining to folks that with this slide that we're beyond this sort of equal treatment. We recognize, and the governor who I am appointed by recognizes that just like we talk about classrooms not being the same, not all communities are the same. And therefore, we're going to have to move around these boxes to make sure that everybody has the same sort of inherent rights that we expect in an environment and other things too, like education and stuff like that. So I'm going to start my presentation real quick by saying thank you all for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. As Caroline mentioned, I'm going to go over a few things with respect to the state. And I work for Cali, PA. It says EPA on there, and I just want to make sure that, you know, I'm with the state of California. And I'm going to go over a tool that we developed at Cali EPA to help it further environmental justice work. But before I do, I kind of wanted to set the stage a little bit up, tell you a little bit about myself. Next slide, please. So this is where I come from. It's actually where CRPE actually does a lot of work in the Central Valley. It's this big sink that the state has where a lot of our fruits and vegetables come from, as well as a lot of other things. And this is my little town. I grew up in a town of 750 people. Next slide. And as I was growing up, I'm a son of activists, environmental justice activists. And as I was growing up, my parents were always fighting these particular environmental injustices. This is one of them. The agency that I worked for thought it was a good idea when I was around 6 years old to put all of California's tires in our community and burn them. And I remember my parents going through that struggle and always seeing that, you know, my parents fighting against our local government and our state agencies, trying to sort of stop them from doing this, and seeing time after time the process working out with a certain outcome, and the outcome very rarely reflecting what communities want to see, right? Next slide, please. This is another image. Just down the road, we have one of 3 ways to, we burn our trash. And there's only 3 of these in California, which, you know, is relatively close to me. Again, another fight that my parents and siblings, you know, engaged in to sort of help prevent. But again, another impact in my local community. There's a theme here. Go ahead. And so this is our actual town water center. So for all my life, I've never been able to drink our water. We trucked in the water, and or, you know, not trucked in the water, but we use the 5-gallon bottles. We have severely high nitrate contamination. My mom and residents fought for this $2 million treatment center, but for the longest time we were drinking waters that exceeded the maximum contaminant level for nitrates as well as other chemicals. Next slide. We, and maybe you just go to the next slide again. We obviously live in an agriculture area. This is where I went to school. And as you can see, you know, over here is the tire pile. Here was the incinerator. Here's the landfill. Here is the crop dust. You can see the strip right next to our school. Lack of drinking water. And growing up, and we knew that we were in an air basin that had some of the worst air in the nation. So growing up, we were experiencing this idea of cumulative impacts. A lot of environmental justice activists talk about cumulative impacts a lot, but for us, like we were living that, and we were and it was you know, a problem. And so when I came to the state, I thought, and it was always a case of where this was something that just community members were like, would go to local government, but local government would never, or state government would rarely acknowledge these impacts, right, together. And so when I got to the state and there was an opportunity to sort of develop a tool that looked at cumulative impacts, I thought, well, this is great because now it's a chance for our communities to tell our story about the impacts that we face. So next slide, please. And these were some of the obvious cumulative impacts that I was talking about in the previous presentation. Next slide. So I got to the state in 2012 and recognized that there was an opportunity here to develop a tool that could rank areas of the state and tell a story of who in fact is more polluted in the state than other areas, who in fact are more vulnerable to pollution than other areas of the state. So we created this tool called CalEnviroScreen. It looks at 19 indicators, and it really, one, I'm very proud to say that the state is acknowledging that there are areas that are heavily burdened by pollution and vulnerable to that pollution. And we have a tool that evaluates pollution and the vulnerability, and it's available in Spanish. Next slide, and I can show you exactly what it looks like. And so it essentially takes all these sort of indicators and it puts them into a formula that gives an initial score, and then we rank each area or census tract to give us an idea of where are those communities that need our assistance. And these are things that, some of these are described in my, in the previous story, but there are other sort of pollution sources that are picked up in here too as well. Next slide. And so here are some of the results. If you go online, you can see them. You can go to your neighborhood, see where you sort of where you fall out. You know, clearly it's kind of, I'll go through the regional stuff, but clearly, maybe hit the next slide. Here's the Bay Area, and for many it's probably no surprise the areas that are red and orange, right? And so what we found is that it's a really funny process because we created this tool, spent a lot of money and a lot of time doing it, but all it does is affirm what the community already knows, right? But it wasn't, but it was worth doing, as I think Amy and others will get into, as far as how we further along the conversation of what Caroline was referring to about changing the outcomes. And so, you know, this sort of catches us up from 2 decades of probably studies that show this, but now it's the state acknowledging it. Next slide, please. This is what the Bay Area looks like. This is the Central Valley. So they obviously have challenges, air challenges, and water challenges, and pesticides. And next slide, we'll show you LA and San Bernardino. This area, you know, LA gets a lot of attention, but this area to the east of LA, Pomona, San Bernardino, Riverside, some of the most serious challenges in the state. And if you ever get a chance to go out there and try to understand some of the environmental issues there, I would recommend it because it's quite serious down there, over there. Next slide. So as I was doing this presentation last night, believe it or not, you know, flying to the state agencies' emails is a headline that says this, the R word. And I say, oh, that's interesting. And I open it up, and it's a discussion that some of us at a leadership level are having about race, but that's what it was titled. So I thought I'd just, you know, put it in here. And this is race. So great. We have this tool about cumulative impacts, and Amy will explain some of the ways that we work at it. But I want to talk a little bit about race. So next slide. So when you look at the final results of those scores of the tool, you know, again, affirming what I think a lot of people already know is, you know, these are the scores for each ethnic and racial group. No surprise that Black folks and Latino folks are on the higher end of that spectrum of the total score, with whites, you know, almost half of Latinos with respect to the score. And if you look at the average, this is the average score of each racial and ethnic group, and here's the general percentile that all those average out to. And so I'm going to show you different ways in which, as much as race, you know, we're talking about race a lot last year, or, you know, a few years. But there was a period there where we weren't talking about race a lot. You know, it's kind of like when we were talking about it. Like, race still matters is what, we sort of talking about. But next slide. This is the breakdown. So this is the breakdown of race by those areas. So if you look at, this 10 represents the top 10%, the most polluted, most vulnerable areas. And this is the ethnic and racial makeup of those communities. And so again, it goes back to the last slide. Clearly, you know, if you look at the most polluted areas of the state, there's 72% brown people, Latinos, you know, and still substantial other people of color. Looks like roughly around 89% people of color in the most polluted areas. And you can see the trends. So, you know, the more polluted areas are obviously whiter. And if you're a Latino or Black, it's kind of tough to make it into these more, you know, less polluted, less vulnerable communities. Next slide. And so what does that mean for these populations? You know, it means that if you look at the top 20% of these communities, of the top 20% census tracts in the state, you know, one in every 3 Latinos live in one of those areas. 1 in every 4 Black folks live in those areas. And so it's important because, you know, a lot of us here, I mean, like, you know, I work a lot with the groups here, you know, and indeed we get civil rights complaints. We get litigated against based on race. And I think it's very important for the state to acknowledge that there are still very much so disparities. And the bottom line is that race is still, we spend a lot of money on this tool, but the color of your skin, it'll still tell you how polluted your community is. That's the base indicator. And it was really interesting because we were going back and forth with the advocates about whether or not race should be an indicator in this tool. And initially it was, and we got a lot of flack and pulled it out. For other reasons, but this is an MCLA course. There was Prop 209 and equal protection clause. There was a lot of reasons why we did that. But when we pulled it out, guess what? It was not having much of an effect on the whole results of the tool because the other indicators in there so well mirrored or represented race. And so you could pull it out and it not change because race had that big of a correlation with the overall score. So I thought this was really important because for like my community that I started with, now if there are the advocates of my community could go to this tool, can punch in their address, and can go to their board of supervisors, to their assembly member, to whoever it is, and say, you know what, it's just not me giving you anecdotal evidence of what I'm experiencing, but the state of California is saying that given in our county or given in our area, we are being burdened the most. We are suffering the most with respect to environmental pollution and vulnerability. And so therefore, we should be on the sort of in the front of the line when it comes to those benefits. And that's what I'm really most proud about. We haven't solved some of the really hard environmental justice problems. It's cool. It's not going to solve the really, really hard stuff. That's going to take years of advocacy and struggle and power. But where I'm very happy to see is that this tool has really been able to, it's really facilitated this idea of prioritizing the benefits in this community. Benefits is not the whole story. I understand that, and we still got to address the real burdens. But we've made some tremendous progress, and I believe that the environmental movement in California, if you haven't been paying close attention, it's changed. It's changed on its head. And the people in power now are, believe it or not, people of color. And the communities and organizations that have been fighting for environmental justice. And the sort of mainstream environmental organizations are having to step aside or sort of play a supplemental role right now. But if you look at who's driving the policy in Sacramento, it's people of color, it's legislators of color. And so this whole environmental movement here in California has changed, and I suspect that this is just a sort of an early indication of what is going to happen to the rest of the nation eventually. So with that shift, we are seeing changes in policies, changes in laws. You see that our Air Resources Board has now 2 environmental justice members, of which if you asked advocates 5 years ago, they'd say you're crazy. And there's bills proposed, as I hear, like for the Coastal Commission to have 3 EJ positions, not 1, but 3, and South Coast ATMD to have 2. So if that doesn't tell you where the shift in the power is going, I don't know if you need to be whacked over the head with it. But it's coming, and so the opportunities, therefore, to really right some of these wrongs in these communities is going to be here for us in these upcoming years. The ability to really stake claim to those benefits that these communities should afford are right, and we really need to really seize this year. And tools like this, believe it or not, and I hope Amy kind of like touches on this, really provide, I call it remove a policy barrier that existed. Like when we try to do these things in the past, they would say, oh, we don't know where those communities are, we don't know how we would prioritize them. And so now that we have a tool that the state recognizes and we've actually put into statute and have used on some of our biggest investments, now it seems like it's okay. And so now we're just figuring out what else can we prioritize for these communities. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll let my good friend here, Amy, take us to the policy world. But thanks again, and hopefully I'm going to stick around. So if anybody wants to chat more, I'd be really happy to. I think that's on the side. It is. Sorry. I'm just screaming to do it, but I just had an example of race. This is Oakland by the BART station, of course. I don't need to tell anybody to Oakland this, but it's like 2% white in this census tract, and and it's like in the top 5% of Cal Fire. So further illustrating the point of what people already know on the ground. But now it's the state putting out that data and acknowledging it and owning it a little bit. Before probably we were running away from it. Okay. Thanks.
Hi. Thank you, Arsenio. Is this on? Yeah. Arsenio is both stealing some of my talking points and also adding new ones in. Thank you, Arsenio. So my name is Amy Vanderwalker. I'm the co-director of the California Environmental Justice Alliance, or CEJA, as we call it. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and thank you, Ms. Yorkie, for having me here. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about SEHA, our alliance, why we formed, and why we do what we do, and the victories that we've had in the policy world. So we're a statewide alliance that was formed about 15 years ago. We have 11 members and partners across California. In addition to Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment, one of our members. There's also one of our founding members in the back of the room, Antonio Diaz from Poder. And we were formed because our members, who are all community-based organizations working on environmental issues that are impacting low-income communities and communities of color directly with residents, they recognize the need to advance environmental justice at a statewide level. After decades of local victories, winning all sorts of incredible things, there's the reality that still our communities are not transformed into the healthy, thriving neighborhoods they deserve to be. And there's still decisions that were being made at the statewide level that have huge local impacts. And at the same time, there was missing an opportunity to really be able to elevate the incredible success that folks were having onto a bigger scale and create the conditions for more communities to have similar successes. And our members also recognize that it was stronger to be united across the state, especially in a place as big as California with politics as intense and complicated and just industry heavy as it is. Being able to do this in unity with other organizations where there's a high level of trust and shared alignment and vision and values would really be much stronger in the long term. So our members formed the alliance and to really focus exclusively in on state policy. So that's really where I work, that's really where SEHA works, and our members bring the their incredible local organizing and many other skills, and most importantly the community organizing, community voices to our alliance. But we formed with a vision for doing state policy differently. We didn't want to just be another advocacy organization. Those many great advocacy organizations. We were really committed to and are really committed to building the power of communities of color who have been left out, who are being disproportionately burdened, really building the power of those residents to shape how policy is made and really make policy from the ground up. So it's not just about advocates or policymakers or decision makers saying, here are the solutions that we need. It's really about elevating the work and the voices and the visions of community residents who are on the front lines, like Arsenio was saying, elevating those solutions and institutionalizing them in state policy. So our vision is really state policy from the ground up. And it's hard. State policy is really complex. It's, by its nature, it's a process of compromise. No one bill or legislative victory can bring environmental justice, and often the policies that we do end up passing are far from what's needed. But it is one really important tool and strategy to pursue, and that's why our members formed the alliance. Not only does policy have very real-world impacts, even as it's very disconnected and can be very far from the ground. For instance, state policies can direct billions of dollars billions of public dollars, can set new regulations on polluters. And there's lots of ways that these decisions that happen at a statewide level have real-life consequences for people in communities that are most impacted. It's also a really important place for us to build our power collectively. The campaigns and the issues that we work on and that we run, they're not just about the legislative outcome. We're not just about the win of passing the bill. It's about inserting the voice of environmental justice into this kind of dominant power structure in Sacramento. It's about making our communities and the issues that our communities are struggling with on a daily basis, making those visible. And it's about pushing decision makers to listen to, act, and be accountable for our issues. And at the end of the day, politics really is about relationships. And if we don't have those relationships, and if we don't have a vision for building those relationships with decision makers, we're not going to get the outcomes that we need. And so we really have seen that investing in developing these relationships and being present, if we're not talking to decision makers about the issues, then we can't expect them to actually do the right thing when it comes time to vote on them. And oftentimes they still don't do the right thing, but we definitely increase our odds of them doing the right thing when we've been talking to them already, when we have a relationship with them, and when we've been educating them on our issues. So it really is an important piece to winning many of the issues that are happening locally. And then I will also say that policy work can provide a much needed leverage point for local campaigns. And when it's done right and when it's done well, there's a really great feedback loop between the local work of the member organizations and the statewide policy. So our members are working with communities directly, identifying issues that are coming up for residents, working with residents to figure out what the solutions they want, bringing those issues to say how we can elevate it and advance those issues in a statewide policy context, and then hopefully make progress, building relationships, and then our members are, and through that process will actually strengthen the political power of our members locally as well, because they're developing relationships with statewide decision makers. So it's this feedback loop that, hopefully more and more will increasingly lead to positive outcomes for all of us. One example of that is with one of our members, and actually San Bernardino, where Arsenio was talking about the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. They've been working on land use issues for a long time. Land use issues are a core environmental justice issue like this. How it is that industrial facilities, including facilities, are often located next to low-income communities and communities of color. Really, a lot of that comes down to land use and how development is happening. In San Bernardino, there's just a lack of health protective land use policies. So CCAJ has been working with residents there to advance environmental justice element in the general plan. So really looking at how can they create a new blueprint for doing land use better in Riverside, where there's a lot of warehouses, there's a lot of goods movement, there's a lot of trucking. And so they've been working on this issue for years, and then a new senator was elected in the area, Senator Conaleva, who we also started developing a relationship with in the Capitol, and then they started working with CCAJ. CCAJ took Senator Leva, who represents that area, on a Toxic tour, really started educating her about the issues locally, which she didn't know about. She's a great champion, but she came out of labor, is not familiar with environmental justice issues. So they really did this great work of bringing her directly to residents, letting her hear from people who were impacted. And now, right now, we have a bill that's moving that's authored by Senator Leva that would require an environmental justice element across the state. So that's been a great example of how the local organizing can combine with the state policy to hopefully advance change. We'll see how that goes. And I think the reality is that right now in California, we have incredible opportunities to use policy in conjunction with other strategies to redefine environmentalism. And when I say that, I'm really thinking we think about how we can redefine environmentalism to include environmental justice and equity at the core, rather than kind of an added-on element as it often has been for the past several decades. We have a huge opportunity to lift up the issues that community residents across the state that our members work with, to lift those issues up and bring them into state policy and politics in really a new way. And that's because of what Arsenio was getting at. People of color are the majority in California, and they're a growing political force, both at the ballot box, but also in organizing policy work. In the 2016 legislature, both the leaders of the Assembly and the Senate are Latinos. They're both from districts that are highly impacted by pollution. Many of the old environmental leaders are turning out, so folks like Senator Fran Pavley, who led a lot of climate change policies, she's leaving office. And so there's really this kind of changing of the guard in the legislature. There's a lot more legislators of color in general. And there's a growing recognition that the environmental policy and politics, the way it's been done over the past few decades, it doesn't have the same relevance given this change in demographics in California, and that to be successful, environmental policy really needs to be speaking to the health and quality of life issues that environmental justice communities are facing on a regular basis. Decision makers are looking for new messengers and new leadership, and they want to be doing environmental policy and see that they can be leaders on environmental policy, but they want to do it differently themselves. And they really want to put the issues that their constituents are facing in the center as well. But at the same time, we can't assume that just because we have a more diverse legislature, for example, that we have more inclusive environmental policies. We also have the rise of the moderate Democrats, who are kind of business Democrats, who are beholden to industry. Their numbers and their power is growing, and many of them are legislators of color. They can hold up progressive policies, for sure. We saw that last session with some of the big climate and energy bills. And then we also see increased attacks on a local level from more conservative forces. And CRPD is nothing new in places like the Valley, where there's still real conservative strongholds. But for instance, in the South Coast Air Quality Management District, we just saw a local attack mounted by Republicans in Big Oil to take over the regulatory agency, and they ousted the longtime executive officer who, while not necessarily the strongest EJ ally, was certainly trying to, was certainly regulating air quality, and they, almost immediately proposed new plans for rolling back regulatory controls on emissions. So, there's still a lot of forces that are at play that make it so just because we have people of color as a majority in California and we have a more diverse legislature doesn't mean that we automatically are going to see better policies. We need to transform this political shift into actual gains for our communities, and we really need to be stepping up as the leaders. We need to have a strong outside voice organizing in these communities, and we need to be really putting forth our solutions and the solutions that come from the communities where we work. So that's what CEJA is trying to do, and the good news is that a lot of that is happening already through the work of our member organizations and what we've been doing on a statewide level. And so in 2015, we actually saw, I think, the fruits of a lot of this really decades of organizing and hard work and movement building and capacity building and relationship building. And we had a series really of pretty groundbreaking environmental justice wins in the legislature. And just starting with Calvaro screen, I will say that in and of itself is a huge win to have that, and that really Arsenio has done a really incredible work at pushing that tool forward. And part of the reason why it's such an important win is that, for years, one of the things we've always gotten from policymakers is this question of, well, sure, I understand that there's EJ issues, but how do you identify these communities and where are they? And Calvaro screen has basically provided an exact answer to that. That's scientifically and academically sound and peer review, and is from a state agency. So that having Calvaro screen has kind of really redefined some of the possibilities within state policy, because we have this tool and we're seeing it inserted in tons of different policies, from directing billions in climate investments, transportation dollars, enforcement initiatives. So mostly it's really been focused on how do we bring the benefits into these districts, but we are very hopeful that we can start looking at how we can also address the burdens as well. So that has been a huge victory. Other victories, we passed a bill, AB 693, that was also the culmination of really multiple years of hard work. And that created the nation's largest program specifically for installing solar on multifamily affordable housing in the nation. So it's $1 billion specifically for solar installations on affordable housing in environmental justice communities. It's $100 million per year. And it also is one of the only programs to direct the energy savings back to tenants rather than just back to the property owners. So that was a huge victory. Arsenio also mentioned another bill that created 2 new seats on the Air Resources Board, which is really one of the most powerful regulatory agencies in the state and is in charge of implementing and overseeing our climate policies. And one of our co-founders, Diane Temporian, was appointed to this board. We're starting to see how these years of organizing and work is really starting to pay off, and having our folks in these seats of power. And then, just starting to see what is the opportunity there now with our voices on the ARB. Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment actually really led on a great bill, SB 673, which is one of the first bills. It increases permitting requirements around hazardous waste facilities, which, as Ingrid will talk about, is one of the first issues that really birthed the environmental justice movement. And this bill not only increases the permitting standards, but also is one of the first to really require looking at cumulative impacts in permitting, which is huge. And then, SB 350, the Renewable Portfolio Standard that passed, which is a huge success for all of California. But we really saw with SB 350 in particular, and some of these other bills, that the impacts on low-income communities and communities of color, the impacts on whether these pieces of legislation were benefiting or harming our communities, it took front and center in all of the entire legislative debate. And Arsenio and I like to talk about sitting there at the end of session where, it's this mad scramble to get all the bills passed by the deadline. It just gets crazy, and people are camped out watching the floor sessions where all of the assembly members and the senators are taking their final votes into the wee hours of the morning. And it was like watching all of these decision makers try and one-up each other on how much they cared about environmental justice. And this was on, one of the biggest bills of all of 2015 across like the hundreds of bills that are passed in California. SB 350 was one of the biggest ones, took up all the air in the Capitol, and in the final debates, everybody's talking about whether they feel like it impacts negatively or positively PJ communities. So that is really a huge shift. And again, this shift doesn't mean that we're gonna make all the wins we need to make, or that everybody's gonna automatically, do the right thing on these bills. But it does really show that there's a huge opportunity for us. And it's a result of all of the years of hard work and organizing that our members and SEA has put into this. And it shows that we can really make even bigger wins around climate and environmental justice more broadly in the future. And I would just say that, even as we have these opportunities, one of the most important things to remember is that the policy work and SEA's vision is never just to have the policy work alone in isolation. Because it's not grounded, it's not going to be really truly reflective of the issues and communities if it's just policy work alone. But it's also just not going to help us, it's not going to build the movement that we want. So it's got to be policy work with grassroots organizing, with leadership development, with movement building, and electoral work. And the reality is we need all of that, those strategies to build a successful movement, but we have a huge opportunity to do so right now. So that's
This was way louder. Thank you for your time. Thank you, CRP, as well, for having me. My name is Roger Lynn. I'm an attorney with Communities for a Better Environment. If you want to hear more about my organization, we are also an environmental justice organization, and please come talk to me afterwards. But for now, I will say that I interned with CRP in, I think, 2003. So yeah, it's been a while. Anyway, I've been given the thrilling task of talking about the environmental justice laws out there. There really aren't any, so I'm just going to hand it over to Ingrid. No, there really are no laws targeting EJ, I'm really not joking. But there certainly are policies, for example, the benefit ones that Amy and Arsenio were just talking about, but Governor Brown's recent executive order on greenhouse gas reduction goals, state agencies should be guided by the principle of protecting the state's most vulnerable populations. The same with AB 32, the same guidance to achieve actual local reductions in pollution. But this latter example highlights the clear and obvious problem with these policies. They are not mandates. So please consider that Black Lives Matter, but you don't actually have to consider that Black Lives Matter. That was a bit cynical. So we are making incremental progress, but the legal world, the laws are way behind. At the end of the day, environmental justice advocates have to be creative with existing statutes and not necessarily environmental ones. I'm going to talk about two of them, the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and California Government Code 11135. So for CEQA, for the non-lawyers and non-environmental lawyers in the room, just to sum up quickly, CEQA is a look before you leap statute. The characters we have in our CEQA story, and this is a gross oversimplification, but there is a lead agency that is deciding whether to approve a certain project. The agency, whether a city, county, air district, for example, is typically comprised of local electeds that are accountable to their constituents. And then there's the applicant, who proposes a certain project in a certain community. If the project has the potential for significant environmental impacts, then the lead agency, with the applicant's credit card, prepares a document called an EIR, an Environmental Impact Report, to describe the project. Then you have the affected community who must live with this new project. That community usually gets a tiny amount of time to comment on the EIR, attend hearings held by the lead agency, and testify regarding their concerns. And finally, you have labor. Those that have been promised new or continued jobs if a certain project is approved, and it's the classic jobs extortion that we all know about. CEQA requires an agency to balance these competing concerns and whether to certify or approve the EIR as accurate, and if so, provide conditions of approval. I want to highlight one particular example, Chevron's recent expansion of its refinery in Richmond, one of the communities that we organize in. In 2005, Chevron proposed its hydrogen renewal project to the city of Richmond. The city, as the agency, had to consider Chevron's project. Chevron said it was just to recover hydrogen. It was the most environmentally friendly, beneficial thing ever. Blah, 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 blah. One of our scientists, however, dug into Chevron's application and found that the true purpose of the project was to allow the refinery to refine different oils, stuff that it wasn't traditionally refined in Richmond. So basically, Chevron lied. CEQA provided a platform for our community members to call out the city of Richmond and Chevron for lying about the true nature of the project, and that was over the course of several public hearings that reached way into the middle of the night. The city and Chevron had kept the community in the dark about a Project Crude Switch that would skyrocket local pollution, and without owning up to it, there was no way for the CEQA process to even do anything about that or provide the necessary mitigations. That violated CEQA. Flash forward to 2010, and the Court of Appeal agreed. In 2010, the Court of Appeal ordered Chevron and the city to redo its application, including providing adequate mitigation for huge greenhouse gas increases because of refining of the different quality crude in Richmond. In 2012, Chevron was about to release its environmental impact report, but then in August 2012, Chevron exploded. It was a massive fire that sent 15,000 community members to local hospitals, almost killed 15 workers. The United States Chemical Safety Board came and investigated and determined that a root cause of the explosion of the fire was a pipe rupturing because it was corroded from refining lower quality oil, the same lower quality oil that the Hydrogen Renewal Project was designed to allow the refinery to bring more of into Richmond. This shone an even greater spotlight on Chevron's new project. In 2013, the new EIR finally surfaced, now entitled then the Modernization Project. It did analyze the change in crude quality, but also underestimated pollution from the refineries and Richmond's biggest source of particulate matter. Our communities and allies, including labor, environmental, academic, public health groups like the California Nurses Association, mobilized and again over the course of several hearings reaching into the middle of the night, pointed out the new EIR's several deficiencies, and this momentum, following the 2012 fire, pushed Chevron to negotiate a significant monetary community benefits agreement. It was $90 million, which included $30 million for local greenhouse gas mitigation projects, including local hire provisions, and the remaining $60 million going to local scholarships and infrastructure improvements, including a solar facility on Chevron's site. Our community members also conveyed the dangers of transporting crude by rail, which still is a hot topic now, winning a condition that Chevron could never even refine a drop of oil that came from an oil train. So when the city again certified the EIR, which they were going to do anyway because they wanted $90 million, did we challenge it to address the community's concern about the excess particulate matter? No. Instead, we found a way to challenge the project's air permit, and for two reasons. First, we didn't want to get in the way of that community benefits agreement at all. Second, and more importantly, challenging the air district's permit through the air district route provided another forum for public comment and public engagement. Another CEQA suit would have taken another 5 years.
Working on EJ's most sexy issue, waste. I never thought when I started as an EJ attorney I would get so excited about talking about sewage sludge and waste facilities and compost, but once you get me started, it's hard to stop me. So it is something that I care very deeply about. So I'm going to take us back to the very beginning. As Caroline mentioned, hazardous waste siting is one of the first acknowledged EJ issues. Beginning back in 1987, the United Church of Christ released the first report linking the siting of hazardous waste facilities to the proportion of people of color living near those sites. It found the race to be the most significant factor in hazardous waste facility siting, more than income, more than class, more than anything else. It found that communities with clustered facilities, with 2 or more facilities, there were 3 times the percentage of people of color in communities without any facilities, and twice that for single facilities. This report also found that nationally, 3 out of 5 African American and Latino residents in the US lived in communities with an uncontrolled toxic waste site. So these are pretty astronomical numbers. And it really was the impetus for a lot of organizing and movement building in the EJ world. So that's now nearly 30 years ago, and we've had a lot of progress. You've heard about some of the issues and some of the progress we've made since then. There's been federal executive orders. Clinton in 1994 passed Executive Order 12898, requiring federal agencies to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health impacts. Local agencies have increasingly incorporated EJ principles, though again, those really do focus on process rather than outcomes. There's been academic study after study showing that these disparities exist and persist. And finally, there's been a lot of local community organizing and a lot of recognition of best practices around how can we make sure that communities of color are not impacted. How can we fight back at the local level? And there's been a lot of communities that work with advocate groups like ours where we've had successes. So 20 years after this initial report came out, you would think that given all of the attention placed on it, we would see considerable progress since those initial numbers. But in 2007, the United Church of Christ did a follow-up report, Hazardous Waste and Race at 20. And it found not only did things not improve, it had actually gotten worse, despite the attention and despite the work and despite the agency regulations and despite the executive order. So now, host neighborhoods of commercial facilities, there are 56% people of color, whereas non-host communities are 30%. California, incidentally, has the highest number of people of color living near hazardous waste facilities in the entire US at 81%. So I think this really requires us to do some reflection. What hasn't worked? Why have we not been able to achieve the change that we really need to see, at least in hazardous waste siting? And this is what I've been giving some thought to for the last 2 years. And these are my thoughts on the issue. The EJ movement depends on the local advocacy effort. We build community power. Our work is an inherently local thing, making sure that the decisions that happen in a location, a particular location, is more equitable and protective of communities. Waste disposal is a zero-sum game. Unless we stop producing waste, that waste has to end up somewhere. When EJ advocates are successful in their advocacy at the local level, the waste projects go to even more vulnerable, less empowered communities. So we end up shifting the burden from community to community to community. So this is difficult. We believe in local work and empowering our communities. But yet we can't be everywhere. We can't be in every community. And until the structural inequities change, until we see waste facilities and waste companies targeting more affluent areas in California, or unless we take out entire waste streams, we're not going to solve the issue unless we take on the structure. So there are 2 things that we can do if we want to protect all communities of color in California and in the US from these sightings, these intractable sighting issues. 1, reduce the overall amount of waste. Or 2, we have to create structures that better protect all communities of color. And so it is with this framework that about a year and a half ago, I began to get increasingly disillusioned with my site-specific advocacy, especially when I kept hearing that other communities in California had this exact same problems, that they too were fighting, insulated from other communities, for their own help. And so I decided that we needed to change the structure to a collaborative, across-community approach to structural reform. So I created something called the People's Senate. And the idea here is that instead of, is to have representatives from communities across California come together, not to be in a reactive stance, not to always be playing defense when companies come and try to cite, but to take on the state and to tell the state we want to see better hazardous waste management, better citing practices. We want you to be accountable to the public that you're meant to protect, and we're going to tell you what we need. So we brought together similarly situated communities, those that were impacted by the state's management of hazardous waste, and specifically to one agency that seemed to be at the center of all of the problems, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC, and I'll probably fall into using the acronyms. And DTSC is the agency name that we figured would be the best target in order to tackle some of the structural issues. We brought 13 communities together with about 23 community leaders from across California. And we worked with them to define or to identify the problems each of them faced, to figure out if there are commonalities across communities, to brainstorm in a perfect world, how would DTSC treat their communities better? How could they protect their communities better? And then to prioritize. And we did this in some pretty long brainstorming sessions. And we came out with a report, the People's Senate Building a New Vision for DTSC. And in here we have the stories of all of the communities that participated. We have the common problems, systemic, structural problems that the people identified, as well as the visions for reform that the community said, we need to see happen at DTSC for you to protect us. And we published it. And we started using this as the basis for changing the framework to an offensive approach at tackling the insurmountable problems at DTSC. I just want to use one example. One example of the issues identified by communities is that DTSC, the department, has no criteria that it uses to determine when a hazardous waste facility should receive a permit to receive hazardous waste. It was completely discretionary. There was no public standard that we could look to say, this facility is inappropriate for this community. So let's change that. Let's make sure that there's criteria that we can look at, that we can hold the agency accountable to say it is inappropriate for this facility, whether it be compliance, whether it be where the facility is located and the vulnerability, this is not appropriate to make this decision. So what have we been able to accomplish? After we published the report, we were invited by several oversight committees in the legislature to share our stories. We walked the halls with this report to every legislator that was interested and they had big toxic waste problems in their districts. We started drafting legislation dealing with this criteria issue, as well as bringing more oversight and accountability to DTSC. The first year of People's Senate existence, this was last year, we passed a comprehensive DTSC reform bill, SB 812, authored by now President Pro Tem Senator De Leon. Unfortunately, that bill was vetoed by the governor. So we tried again. So we tried again this year, yes. Tell me how I really think about Governor Brown. We tried again this year, and we had to scale it back But this past year, we passed SB 673. It was signed by the governor. And for the first time ever, we have in California required the Department of Toxic Substances Control to consider community vulnerability. It's the first kind of its law in the United States. It is something that EJ advocates across the country have asked for and wanted. In fact, you know, I'm a little bit proud of this law. Bloomberg said this is the one new environmental justice law you should know, the New York publication. And I'm going to quote from the article. It is a first step by a bellwether state toward establishing a highly sought after environmental justice requirement in permitting. The law could foreshadow where national conversations are headed and show what goals are becoming feasible in efforts to help protect overburdened communities. This is just 1.5 years after we began this effort. In addition, since the People Senate started, we have an EJ director at DTSC whose sole job is to ensure that environmental justice is being considered and there's a point person with links directly to the head of the agency. We've established bi-monthly accountability calls where DTSC is called upon to answer to all of the communities that are part of the People Senate on progress in their individual communities. We've got an independent review panel. This is a 3-member panel that was convened solely to provide recommendations on how to improve DTSC. We passed a second bill, which requires that hazardous waste facilities that are serial violators, those are 3 or more serious violations in a 5-year period, have their permits revoked. We've provided education, important education to DTSC. We provided an 11-stop toxic tour to the director of DTSC so that she could see for herself and talk to herself the people that are directly impacted by the decisions of her agencies. We've provided a roadmap with benchmarks for how DTSC is performing and protecting our communities, and we are tracking it. So the one question that remains is, are the individual communities that make up the People Senate, are they better off? Are they better protected? And frankly, it's a big question mark at this time. When I started this, I believe that if we change the structures, that we would see on-the-ground improvements in communities, because that's what had been missing. But there is a significant lag time between passing these bills and having these improvements and seeing those on the ground. Communities still are saying that their communities have not been improved based on our work. We have established a matrix to determine success, and we are tracking it monthly to make sure that we know if things are going to get better. But since we've only been doing this for 2 years, I am confident that eventually the structural changes that we are establishing at DTSC will trickle down and have real impacts. And in the meantime, each of the communities that are part of the People Senate are supporting each other. We now know, and we can compare how one community is being treated in comparison to another. We can see the various cleanup goals for cleanup sites. And we're also seeing, when there are public processes, communities are now coming together and supporting each other to make sure that we can increase our power just in terms of our collective strength. So I want to end with a plea that this model should be replicated. Even though we haven't yet seen the on-the-ground impacts, I do think it is a step in the right direction. And until we address head-on these structural constraints that are keeping our communities downtrodden, we won't really achieve the huge EJ wins that we need. And we can do it by agency. We targeted the Department of Toxic Substances Control, but there are a lot of agencies in California that are frankly failing our communities. We have the Division of Oil and Gas. We have the PUC. We have various air and water boards. We have counties, entire counties that are not protecting their communities. And when we start systematically figuring out why they're failing our communities, then we can band together and start to build those structural reforms. We also can have People Senate by issue. So my dream is that we will have the People Senate for DTS reform, that's the first one. But I want to see the People Senate for all kinds of things. I want to see it throughout California, and I want to see it throughout the US. And I think it's a good model and one that I'm pushing, obviously. So I think with that, I'm in, and I think we're going to open it up to questions. Thank you.
So Jonathan's going to pass around the mic if anybody has some questions for our panelists.
I'm loud. That was great. Thanks to you all. Arsenio, I had a question about where you're seeing Calabaro's screen being used on the ground. Where's the rubber hitting the road there?
Oh yeah, I mean, in my own community, we've used it. Just last week, I was in, we were on a panel in Sacramento where the Sacramento region used the data in Calabaro screen to rescreen their area and sort of hold their local officials accountable to those communities that they've highlighted as super impacted. That may, on a statewide scale, may not be shown as super impacted, but on their 5-region county basis, they've identified those areas that need work. And so we actually, we're seeing some developments there in Sacramento, but time and time, I mean, there's a lot of different ways in which Calabaro screen has been used. I think the Attorney General has used it for some of your oil cases up here with respect to intervening on crude by rail, highlighting that the tool shows that these communities, I think this one was Martinez, I think the Martinez one, are already overburdened and calling the question as to when is enough in these communities. But there are countless efforts in LA. The data is used under the Clean Up Green Up initiative. They've identified 3 green zones in LA that are looking at ordinances for the city to improve the conditions, many of which are sort of conditions that community's been asking for a long time. Like if you build a home next to a freeway, that you somehow mitigate that impact through maybe an air filtration system, or lessen the amount of concentrations of a certain type of industry in this area that already has a high concentration. So there's been a lot. I mean, if you just Google it, you'll see it. I think that was always the goal. I mean, the goal was it was a state tool to focus state policy and prioritize the state's initiative, but knowing that the information would trickle down to the locals and also, provide help. I mean, the federal government pushed out environmental justice screen, a national tool. And quite frankly, we spent a lot of our time over the last 2 years working with them to help them roll out their tools. So I've seen it work out quite extensively. That's just for action. It's also been used to make the case for need and for grants and for a whole host of other things. We use it for enforcement. So we have, as somebody mentioned here, a targeted enforcement group that goes into EJ communities and brings not just the air people, but the collection of people that are responsible for various environmental crimes. So we're seeing it play out a lot. And I want to now give you a chance to talk about Ingrid's, bill that, she was quoting Bloomberg as saying, but I was just on a call with the National and Ecos, the Council of States, and who do they want to talk to me about? They want to talk to me about like that bill, and the meeting was EJ committee, because that is the holy grail, so to speak, in environmental justice. This is what everybody's been working on for 3 decades. And now, with the help of the People Senate, now it's law. You have to consider vulnerability when you're making that commit. Now, as they were talking about, I've been dealing with the last few days, I've been trying to figure out how we're going to implement that. Calabaro screen was one of the initial sort of pieces of information that were, if you look at this bill, you see the information that's written in the bill, you say, oh, that's the kind of stuff that Calabaro screen talks about. And so we're figuring out a way to use the data. It's going to be a huge, huge challenge. You're right, nobody takes into consideration vulnerability into permits. This will be the first. We're going to rely upon tools that help us make those decisions. But I agree with Bloomberg that a lot of the nation is watching with respect on that environmental justice on that. Now it's up to DTSC and the agency to implement that law. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do.
Question, anybody else?
I was wondering just what Ingrid said, that no matter income or class or whatever, race is the dominant factor in whether you live near, hazardous facility. And I was wondering if in California there's been research on that, and if there's any kind of thought about bringing that into the discussion more, even though it's not included in California.
Yeah, I think the CRP has done some research on that, looking at the hazardous facilities in California. I know there's been a ton of work, especially through Manuel Pastor and them, on hazard proximity to EJSM. So they in fact have a tool that will show you the points of where, how close certain hazardous sort of facilities are to a certain point. And an interesting thing is that the Air Resources Board helped fund that tool, and now we actually own that tool now. So like Cali EPA will be able to take advantage of that data too. I'm sure there's I don't know, anybody else can add to it. I'm sure there's plenty of work out there.
Yeah, we've done some analysis on looking specifically at race and doing a race overlay with hazardous waste facilities in California. So we do have that analysis, and it's no surprise what the results were. DTRC actually itself just did an overlay with the hazardous waste facilities and Cal EnviroScreen, and that's on their website now. So I've been interested to get more into the weeds on that. I haven't looked at it closely, but especially the Cal EnviroScreen and the usability of it really is opening a lot of doors for just lay people to do this type of analysis.
Yeah, we post it. So if you go now, we release it by indicator now. So you go to the hazardous waste indicator on Cal EnviroScreen, look at area, it'll show all the sites, and then you can look at how that compares to these other things, which I was showing here. Sometimes you can look at race and to see how that correlates. And we of course provide all the data.
Hi, I'm fighting with my colleagues here a surface mine that's very, very close to our neighborhood that is overwhelmingly Latino and mostly monolingual. The EIR has been issued by the county, and it took them 7.5 years to issue it. And I've been asking them to translate the documents, and they've refused. I'm aware of Title VI, but has anyone had any success in getting CEQA documents translated into languages that the neighborhoods can use?
So CRPE did bring that particular case in Kings County against the Kettleman City Hazardous Waste Facility in the 1990s. And I think this is the only case where there's been a decision on that, and we prevailed. We prevailed on that issue. Unfortunately, it is a Superior Court case, and the case, the applicant dropped the project before any decision was appealed. So it's not precedential, but it should be, instructive. In addition, there are provisions in CEQA that mandate that EIRs be understandable to the public. And I think that can be taken a number of ways. A lot of what courts have traditionally looked at is whether or not the document is, understandable to a layperson without a lot of technical expertise. But in communities where the predominant language is not English, to be understandable, it would have to be translated. And so I think that's a really key provision of CEQA and something that should be looked at in a case.
Can I get the title case from you? Is it on?
Probably. It's hard to find. We have it.
I need it.
Yes, I think we at least have the decision.
Yeah.
I don't know that we've had the
Okay.
So I'm an attorney and I work for the state, and so don't think this is legal advice. But I guess Roger mentioned the government code 10135.
Right.
We didn't mention there's an administrative process for 10135. You don't need an attorney. You write a complaint, and if that agency gives money to that particular entity that is whatever process this is under, you can file a discrimination complaint, and we as a state would have to process that administrative complaint. We actually reached an agreement in the town of Gonzales in Salinas in Monterey County, where in this town of Gonzales, predominantly 90% Latino. They were proposing a waste to energy incinerator there. prior even to the scoping plan, there was some notices, actually notices for some scoping plans that weren't in Spanish. And in fact, this was pretty ironclad case. The Spanish, when they did try to do Spanish, they forgot to put the date in. So it was a defective notice. The community group, along with a group called Green Action here in the city, filed a 11135 administrative complaint with us, with the Cal EPA and in particular Cal Recycle, who was the entity that gave the solid waste division money. And we reached a conciliation agreement, and I think it's probably, in my opinion, probably the most, I don't know if you guys have in Richmond or but one of the more protective CEQA provisions protecting communities and language in the state. Through that process, we reached an agreement where the Solid Waste Authority now has to provide at every meeting Spanish translation or interpretation. With CEQA documents, they have to provide a summary of it in Spanish. They had to provide a community advisory committee. All agendas have to be now in Spanish also. And a whole series of language protection cases. The facility never was eventually proposed. I mean, it's still, lingering, but it's pretty much dead. But it's on Cal Recycle's website. There is a different path. Roger mentioned the litigation path for 11135, but and a lesser used path is the administrative path of filing it with the agency. So you don't have to go to court, essentially, what I'm saying. And there have been some examples of its success. It's not very utilized.
And just real quickly, to add to the policy pieces, we did run a bill, a CEQA translation bill 2 years ago. So it has definitely been recognized as a big issue, a big problem. We've tried to address it. That bill did not make it through, so it doesn't help you right now. But I think, there are going to be movements, going into the future to try to make this happen.
Was that the bill that was also vetoed by Governor Brown?
I don't think it made it Governor Brown.
Oh.
I could be wrong. Yeah. I mean, there's national origin protections of language, and if entities are going to take money, whether it's from the federal government or the state government, they have to meet. In fact, if you take federal government money, you have to sign away and say that you will have some sort of language protections. And the same thing with respect to a 11135. If you take the state's money, you're going to have to abide by that. So those are the levers there to pull.
Yeah, I had a question for Arsenio regarding the Colin Virus screen. If a future version would, I was wondering if the future versions of the Colin Virus screen would be able to look at race more easily. Some of the slides that you had up are through analysis that aren't up on the current version of the tool.
Yeah, I think there's a race. We have a race analysis posted on the website, and every time you click, if you go to the final results, anytime you click on a census tract, you just scroll down and you'll see that pie chart. So and we released the data. We actually released the race maps online tool. So all that data is there. I'm not sure if you're looking for a way to cross-analyze them easier. That is something we can talk about and improving upon the race analysis to provide that in a way where you can look at them side by side and overlap the layers. But for the most part, you go to any census tract and you'll see the demographic breakdown on every census tract in the state.
Other questions? I thought I saw one in the back.
I really appreciate the intersectionality and the touch of this event, and I'm wondering if folks know of successful wrongful death claims based on climate injustice, similar to how, there's a wrongful death claim around Eric Garner, who said, "I can't breathe." And I know California has some of the most advanced statute around wrongful death.
Well, speaking of creativity, I think this, it is. We have to be creative. The only thing that comes to my mind are criminal statutes, criminal negligence. And in California, it's very specific in that criminal negligence can also cover continued violations of civil permit conditions. So continually violating your air permit, whatever, doing something in the environmental world that's a civil violation can also be criminal negligence. And that's what happens, not to beat up too much on Chevron again, but in this 2012 as well, Chevron actually guided the air monitor pipe around the monitor. They literally just put it around there. And we had a big community push against it, but in the end, the Contra Costa County District Attorney ended up prosecuting Chevron for criminal negligence, and the remedy required by the terms of probation also mirrored the remedies that we were looking for. So it's creativity. Yes, I don't know, but I like where you're going.
Yeah, I think the last question is kind of as the normal hook, but I just really quick, I also think there's like a causation issue. I think under the tort statutes, I think you really have to show that there's one direct cause. I think part of the problem that we see with the cumulative impacts maps is that there are a lot of causes for a potential wrongful death in terms of contamination, and so I think there would be a causation problem. Unfortunately, but and then I have a question for Arsenio again. So I fully appreciate the progress that we're making, and I think that it's amazing. I think one of the things that Roger mentioned is that in the EIR process, the agency will kind of conduct this environmental review with the corporation's credit card, and I think that's like very nicely put, because I think really it's their consultants that conduct these environmental review processes, and we see from day one that these environmental review documents are built pretty dishonestly, to say the least. And I think that it's really up to our agencies to kind of step up and make sure that that doesn't happen. And I wonder if you see that as a part of this change that's coming over time.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we really, in the grand scheme of things, a lot of the environmental documents are going to be at the local level. DTSC does, get, a fair amount of them, but for the most part, that's, our EIRs, our super documents are sort of light at the local level. But I would say that, really what's helping with that right now, with the consultant, what's happening right now, like going back to Ingrid's, a bill that looks at reviewing the permit process, and now that we're tearing apart, and rethinking and relooking at that whole permit process, it really is just rethinking our participation in CEQA, and to the extent we are not or working well with it. So, for instance, I was a young kid when seeing all this unfold in Kalamazoo City, right, at DTSC, and the locals issued this, permit for, to expand this hazardous waste landfill. And Roger mentioned, the roles of our agency. DTSC is a responsible agency there, and so DTSC in their role, in a very responsible way. If you see at a local level something happening, like for instance, Spanish speakers only in the CEQA process only getting half the time, or not even time as far as English speakers at public comment. As a responsible agency under CEQA, there's an opportunity there to say, hey, or if you don't like what they're doing in the permit, to say, hey, you know what, we don't like these many things. We do it in all other aspects of our work as oversight. In CEQA, it seems to be light. And so right now, because of this review, what we're doing is we're reviewing that, and we're acknowledging that to the extent that we can catch that at the local level, it is going to sort of lessen the load. If we identify and try to mitigate at the local level, like normal people do, some of the environmental impacts, when it does come to DTSC for approval on a CEQA document, we've really hashed out a lot of those instruments. So then relying upon a consultant's review of this stuff, I guess the gravity or the weight of it is less so because we've really handled that more at a local level. And that's a huge gaping hole right now. I think everybody's done a lot of analysis on that and saying that for the most part, we haven't been engaging at the local level as a responsible agency, and that's one of the things we're hoping to fix. So I guess what I'm saying is that through the improvements in our overall SQL process, I'm hoping that we won't just be relying on that end of the day EIR that a consultant has put together, because along the way we have been engaging and we have shaped already this process in a more meaningful way. I think relying on that document, relying on changes on the back end isn't arguing this anywhere. And so we need to start, of course, at the beginning. And these bills that advocates are passing are allowing us to probe into areas that have been completely shut off for a long time. And so it's a tough question. I mean, we could have a whole panel on these SQL documents and inadequacies. Certain areas like the cumulative impact section of SQL is just like, when I got it, I was like, tell me a project that has been really, denied because of it, or anything. It lacks, it lacks, teeth. And I've seen SQL work, I've seen SQL, not be a solution in a lot of circumstances. So we're working on that to improve it. I'm optimistic that we will now see improvements on that to hopefully not have to rely on that back end of the EIR. But that's not an easy question, so thank you. I do my best. I know I put everybody to sleep with that answer, but I tried my best. I don't know what to say.
I did want to add that
Roger.
there is one body at state government, the Attorney General, that is meant to intervene on all of these CEQA projects, and you can tell I'm very unhappy about this. With they've continually asked us to bring legal issues about all these certain projects, and we'll deliver the legal issues. When we deliver the legal issues, they'll say, oh, well, maybe you can give us a political reason to do it. So I think, to sum up, I think it just kind of brings back everything what we're talking about. Like, yes, there are these vehicles, there's this way, there's this method, there's some procedures, but at the end of the day, it's the political process. It's the movement of environmental justice that we need to shape the branches at the top. Blame Kamala. Thank you.
I have a question for Amy, actually. I was wondering if you have worked with elected officials in areas that are not so politically favorable to environmental justice in a lot of ways, and if you have strategies for doing that. Just because I work with Joaquin Valley.
Yeah, I think CRPD should really answer that question. But I will just say, I think certainly in the Valley, and again, just turn it over to them, that's really where we see. And it's really interesting, I think what we've seen at a statewide level, there's actually, statewide politics, it's definitely not perfect, but it is actually much more progressive than local politics in places like the Valley. So, for instance, we just worked on an op-ed that just got published today that was actually really calling out Valley decision makers. We do an environmental justice scorecard every year. We actually brought copies. I brought some copies where we look at the EJ record of all the different assembly members and senators. We also analyzed this year. We analyzed the Black, Latino, and API caucuses to see how legislators of color are doing on environmental justice issues. And then we did a San Joaquin Valley specific analysis to really see how our Valley representatives are doing. And they're doing really bad. So, they're really not champions for environmental justice. So I think there's just so much accountability that has to happen there. I think there's electoral strategies that need to be employed. And CRPD. You want to say more about it?
No, I think that's exactly right. There's certain areas of the state where the politics are much more difficult, and the Central Valley is key among those. And we do have Democrats in the Valley, but they are, in the scorecard, they scored the very lowest. I think we have 44% ranking for Valley legislators. So, I think using these accountability tools is really key. If we don't publicly call out that our legislators are failing people of color in their constituencies, they're going to continue to get away with it. So I think we're ramping up our efforts to hold those legislators accountable. The local government as a whole issue, and I don't think we've gotten it, but electoral politics, building power. Something that CRP just engaged in is building policy platforms for our community. So we had a day-long convene where we brought all of our communities together in order to highlight, what are their policy priorities, and we're going to be able to use this tool again as a benchmark to say, use it at campaign candidate forums, or allow them to use it in candidate forums. Help them make decisions, help them hold their politicians accountable. So it is about accountability, and I think we are figuring out ways to do it.
Just something to add to what Ingrid said, though. I think the beauty of what we achieved with that bill is that it does get around some of those systemic problems in the valley, because you go to people that are more reachable than the legislators in the valley and get around them. And I think that's amazing stuff.
Another way we got around the Kettleman City thing that I mentioned, this idea that people not speaking English only got half the time to make a public comment. For stating to try to model that, when we passed the bill shortly, I think around 2 or 3 years ago, is that make sure at least that the state in their proceedings provided at least double the time. If you needed a translator or one wasn't provided, that there was a 3-minute limit, that you could say your 3 minutes in Spanish or whatever language that you choose, and then you would have a set amount of time for your interpreter to say that too, and not have that count against you, meaning you only have half the time as an English speaker. We passed that law for all state proceedings. We tried at the local level 2-3 years ago. We failed to amend the Brown Act, but I think that's still something that needs to be changed as a way of influencing the local state.
Any other questions?
We're going to open that wine up.
Food's been uncovered. So I'll just ask the panelists if you have any final closing thoughts that you would like to give.
Yeah, when we first started working on this panel, the framework that I came away with is that I believe that environmental justice in California is at a precipice. We are at a tipping point. And I feel it, I've been doing this work for 10 years, and I feel the change, and I'm actually very excited about the policy developments and the power dynamics that are shifting, the new legal tools, 11135, we're trying to figure out how we can really leverage that. This new tool, Virus Screen, and these new models that are dealing with structural changes. Right? This is the panel that's up here today, is collectively, I feel we're in a very exciting moment of time, and I think we're going to see building momentum going forward. So that's why these are the panelists up here, and I'm so excited to continue doing this work, next year and beyond.
I'm just really interested, a lot of the climate movement and a lot of the policy and effort going into, climate change, it's that, that moving bus that I think is going to help and provide a vehicle to advance a lot of environmental justice issues. Not only receive through the funding, but if you can, I showed you the image of Los Angeles and that big red blob, and if you can envision a day in which we, not going to hear south of goods moving on anybody, but if we can envision to move goods through that red blob in a way that is near zero emissions, the lives and the environment for those communities along those corridors will transform. And so, to me, I'm excited about, in my lifetime, being able to see that transformation for those communities. I think it's within our grasp. I think we will be able to see that for ourselves, and I think that is one I'm very pessimistic at times, but that's I have a very optimistic view of we are going to see some transformation in some of these communities through the climate sort of vehicle.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for this very